Hello, I'm Denise Thomas. This is the presentation of the information covered in Chapter 14, Collective Ownership and Community Control and Development, The Long View, by James DePhilippis. Understanding the context in which the framework emerged is useful in understanding the framework in and of itself. It also allows one to view the framework with sensitivity for the goals they are attempting to achieve. DePhilippis dubbed the most important emerging community as the organized communities established by African Americans who managed to be free in the 19th century. These settlers established all black communities. The communities were seen as a shield from the hostilities of racism and a way to pool their resources and help each other until they were able to live on their own. In these communes, people were trained to fit into what they believed was the American middle class. It is ironic that the middle class they saw was a country farmer. Most of the settlers who were slaves had already farmed on plantations and were very familiar with the agrarian way of life. In the communes, they were taught to be better farmers. These communes were short-lived, however. They disappeared shortly after the end of the Civil War. The chapter discusses how Booker T. Washington's comments, though occurring after the organized communities and communes ceased, were consistent with the workings of the communes, in that he believed in the capitalistic notion that blacks must gain economic independence in order to interact with whites on an equal footing. He believed that blacks should establish segregated communities to work on their business success. Once it is achieved, they would be able to communicate with their white counterparts in their communities. Booker T. Washington's theories addresses economic equity, but did not address the unequal constructs that were law throughout most of the country at that time. Money alone was not enough to make a black person equal. The author characterizes Booker T. Washington's inability to address class structures or class conflicts as astonishing. The utopian community's goal was opposite that of the black organized communities. The utopian community's goals was to create places outside the constraints and structures of the capitalistic work of wage slavery and employment-based production. These communities were a combination of Thomas Jefferson's agrarian democracy and John Locke's labor theory of property combined with Robert Owen's socialist ideas. In the 1850s, more Americans were working in the industrial sector, which made it difficult for the utopian communes to reach these people. On page 271, Dr. DePhilippis explains that communes and co-ops converged in the mid to late 1960s, but that the coming together is short-lived. At the time, there were three different types of communes, co-ops with different goals, ideological justifications, and institutional forms. The three strands, as he called them, were the Black Power movement, the direct democracy movement, and the cooperative living movement. From the convergence came the Community Development Corporation, or the CDC, which he says was and is the principal institutional vehicle for community development in the United States. There are a series of acronyms used in this chapter for legislation that was passed in the 1960s, which enabled the CDC to exist and function. The 1964 Economic Opportunity Act was enacted to fight the war on poverty. As part of the act, the OEO, which is the Office of Economic Opportunity, was created. The Community Action Agency was the mechanism provided for community members to organize, plan, and become active. On page 272, Dr. DePhilippis explains that the CAA initiative was community empowerment and activism. The Community Action Program, or the CAP, is responsible for CAA oversight. Its philosophy is to maximize feasible participation of community members, especially low-income blacks. Over time, the CAAs were seen as radical watchdogs who were constantly in conflict. In 1967, there was a shift in policy. The Special Impact Program Amendment to the OEO targeted local groups for economic development programs. Additionally, with supplemental funding from the federal government, many CDCs were created. The second shift in federal policy was enacting the Model Cities program, which placed control over anti-poverty neighborhood development policies back into the hands of city governments and explicitly away from the hands of communities. The text indicates that city governments were threatened by the CAP and believed that CAAs, because they received their funding directly from the federal government, were able to bypass city governments and connect directly into national priorities and politics. The Black Power movement was a product of the civil rights movement. Its principal goals or components were to deal with issues of government decentralization and Black participation and control, especially when it came to education and policing. Along with addressing the control over economic relations between Blacks and whites, there was a debate within the community over what form Black ownership should take. Roy Innis was of the opinion that Blacks needed to be innovative and had to create a new ideology apart from capitalism and socialism, and the new ideology needed to fit the Black community. This sentiment dovetailed nicely into Booker T. Washington's theory that Blacks needed to seek economic success within their own community. The debate between Black capitalism and Black entrepreneurialism was won by the Black capitalists. DePhilippis attributes it to the fact that the Black capitalism movement promoted the OEO policies and the Nixon administration, and that there was a lack of clarity about issues of ownership by Black community leaders who were supporting Black entrepreneurialism. Neighborhood control and neighborhood government activists and writers were advocating government decentralization as a means of politically empowering the citizens in the urban areas. Page 275 provides Milton Kotler's view of local politics. He saw local politics as the radical politics of local control. He rejected the centralized welfare policies of the New Deal Great Society variety and the central role of class in the leftist politics. He believed that true radicalism comes from a practical view of a man's political nature, rather than a theoretical view of the state. Its object is to shape the state to fit the present purpose of the popular struggle, rather than reshape the man to fit the state. Co-ops and communes and collectives were evolving around the same time as the Black Power movement and the direct democracy movement. They ranged from apolitical cooperatives to counter-institutions of the new left. The new communes were similar to the 19th century ones in that they failed to transform society because change cannot be effected by simply opting out. You have to have direct confrontations with the structures that govern the political economy in order to make a change, according to the chapter. This framework disagreed with organizing for the sake of race-based or socialistic ends. Saul Alinsky and his organization, Industrial Areas Foundation, argued a brand of organizing that assumed that the only long-term goal should be the mobilization of people to take power for themselves. The model for organization was standardized to be the same for every locality. Locals met with the national organization to discuss their concerns. Then they would work to mobilize large numbers of people in the area. No agendas were brought from the national level. The issues and solutions are defined by the people in that locality. The criticism of the IAF was an organization working to get what they could as opposed to working towards a platform or some goal. In the 1980s, the IAF evolved from confrontational organizations to organized developers. Page 279 offers an example. The Woodlawn Organization, TWO, was a militant community organizing group in Chicago that was one of Saul Alinsky's groups. They staged rent strikes and picket lines and were generally combative. By the 1970s, they were actually functioning as a CDC. Their presence and involvement was linked to the decline of the area because there was a disinvestment from the private sector and there was arson. TWO's short-sightedness was blamed for the downturn in the community. The Neo-Alinsky style emerged, which took a non-ideological perspective. Their goal was to increase participation in and the democratization of urban politics. They were also confrontational. Their belief that power was only appropriated through a struggle, they participated in powerful community-based efforts to prevent the displacement of low-income residents. Under this framework, there was substantial political and legal victories. An example that was given in the chapter was financial redlining, which was where the practice of mortgage companies and insurance companies of refusing to insure or lend money for properties that they deemed to be in low-income areas, and it was disproportionately affecting African Americans, and it was through community participation and the leaders getting involved, they found that it was actually unconstitutional and there are laws against it now. CDCs have evolved over time. Initially, they were created to address community ills like redlining. They were by nature at the time confrontational and received their funding directly from the government. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, CDCs moved from being protest movements to being organizations. Funding reductions forced the CDCs to operate in a more cooperative manner. A surge in the number of CDCs in existence occurred at that time. They went from 150 to between 500 and 750. In the mid to late 80s, the CDCs evolved yet again. Continued cuts to federal funding forced the CDCs to realize the limits to public funding. They began to look for ways of fulfilling their agendas that didn't rely on government funding. With this procedural change, the CDCs began to act more like professional organizations than community activist organizations. The last shift discussed in the chapter happened in the late 1990s through the 2000s. With federal funding drastically reduced, the CDCs were forced to seek creative alternatives for funding. This type of funding, known as patchwork financing, called for partnerships with lending institutions such as Fannie Mae. On page 284, Dr. DeFilippis points out that while CDCs were initially conceived as vehicles that would use the market as a means to the end of community empowerment and control, they have now become vehicles of the market, in which the goal of community control is not even an issue. Dr. DeFilippis points out that the paradigm shifts would be okay if community development had achieved the goals of allowing low-income people to have more control over their economic lives while improving the equity in their lives. This has not happened. The text points out that community development needs to reconnect with its goals of community control, but it must do so in a way that understands capital, capitalism, and class in America. Our society has come a long way since the Black organized communities and communes of the 19th century, but the one constant is capitalism in America. The chapter pointed out that on more than one instance, when social agendas are in conflict with economic competitiveness, the social goals are curbed or cut altogether. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.